Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Sterling said when Sarah Chen walked past the nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, her voice barely above a whisper as she acknowledged a resident's question about medication reconciliation. Sterling didn't look up from his tablet. Didn't acknowledge her response. Just continued his note with the kind of dismissive precision that came from 23 years of assuming the world operated exactly how he'd arranged it. They didn't know what Sarah actually was. They didn't know she'd spent 12 years moving through places most people couldn't pronounce, making decisions under fire that saved lives with the same steady hands now restocking supply carts at 3 in the morning. The rain hammered against the ICU windows like applause for a performance no one was watching. Oak Creek Memorial sprawled across 14 floors in downtown Raleigh, a concrete and glass monument to medicine that hummed with the sound of ventilators and cardiac monitors even during the graveyard shift. Sarah had chosen the night shift for that exact reason: fewer people, fewer questions, fewer opportunities for anyone to look too closely at the woman who'd disappeared from Naval Station Norfolk 4 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a consuming need to stop running. The fluorescent lights of the ICU corridor flickered in their mechanical rhythm as she moved through, pushing a supply cart with one hand while reviewing medication logs on a worn clipboard held against her chest. Her scrubs hung 2 sizes too large, deliberately. Invisibility required a certain amount of shapelessness. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it felt like restraint. Room 314 belonged to Marine Corporal James Rivera, motorcycle accident on day 6 of his admission, sedated on a propofol drip that kept him in a pharmaceutical fog somewhere between unconsciousness and the dreams that would come later. The morning sun would hit his face, the neurologist had said, and they'd start reducing sedation tomorrow. For now, he was a body in a hospital bed with bandaged ribs and a reconstructed femur, still wearing the institutional pale blue gown that erased everything individual about him. Sarah had cleaned his room 17 times in 6 days, more than necessary, but the pattern served her. Observation became invisible when you repeated it often enough. She entered quietly, her movements efficient and practiced. Adjusted the ventilator tubing. Checked the line patency on his peripheral 4. Restocked the catheter supplies in the wall-mounted cabinet with the kind of meticulous attention that made nurses look over their shoulders when they passed. The boots caught her attention the same way they always did: military issue, OCP tan, worn enough to carry stories in the leather. They sat beneath the bed frame, tucked into the space where visiting families didn't typically notice. Someone, probably the Marine himself before the sedatives took hold, had positioned them there with intention. Sarah understood intention. Her own intentions were written in scar tissue. She reached down and lifted the boots, her fingers moving across the leather without thinking. The left one bore faint discoloration along the inside seam, the kind of staining that came from blood. Probably his own. The laces were double-knotted, military style, and when she turned the boot to examine the sole, she saw the call sign burned into the leather inside, anchor, followed by coordinates written in faded marker. Marjah. Helmand Province. The numbers on her forearms matched them exactly, burned there by someone who understood that some maps couldn't be carried on paper. Her breath caught. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her hands to still mid-motion. She exhaled slowly, the way she'd learned to do when helicopter rotors passed overhead and her nervous system wanted to remember it was still at war. The tactical breathing helped. For counts in, hold for 4, for counts out, hold for 4. Her sympathetic nervous system knew better than to argue. Sarah placed the boots in the closet, tucking them into the corner where they wouldn't be visible during morning rounds. When she turned back to the bed, Rivera's eyes were still closed, his face the slack mask of sedation. No recognition. No awareness that he was sharing a room with someone from Marjah, someone who'd carried him 6 miles through enemy contact in the summer heat with his blood soaking through her uniform and her left arm hanging useless from a round that had passed clean through her shoulder. He had no idea. The sedation kept him safe from whatever this was. She envied him that. The hallway outside hummed with the white noise of medical infrastructure, the distant ping of an 4-pump alarm, the soft whisper of the ventilation system, the almost inaudible hum of fluorescent ballasts that never quite went silent. Sarah moved through these sounds like they were a familiar language. She'd learned to move in hospitals the same way she'd learned to move through Marjah, quietly, methodically, attracting no attention. In both places, visibility was a liability. Dr. Marcus Sterling stood at the nurse's station when she emerged from room 314, his posture arranged in the casual confidence of a man who'd never experienced a consequence he couldn't buy his way around. His watch was a Rolex, the kind that cost more than Sarah's rent for 3 months. His shoes were Italian leather, buffed to a shine that suggested someone else maintained them. He was reviewing Rivera's chart with the kind of distracted attention that people gave to paperwork they'd already decided didn't matter. When he glanced up and noticed Sarah approaching with her empty supply cart, his expression shifted into something that resembled observation, though not the kind that involved genuine attention. "Miss Chen," he said, straightening from his position. "A word about your charting habits." Sarah stopped the supply cart 3 feet from the nurse's station. She didn't move closer. Distance was information, and she'd learned that maintaining physical space was the first form of control. "Of course, Dr. Sterling. You've been reviewing medication reconciliations on patients outside your direct assignments." His tone was conversational, almost friendly, the way a predator's voice became gentle right before the strike. "I noticed it in the system logs. Room 312, 316, Rivera's chart in 314. 3 separate patients, none of whom fall under your current caseload." Sarah's hands remained perfectly still on the supply cart handle. No tremor. No tension visible in her shoulders. When she'd learned to move through Fallujah, she'd learned that your body was a constant broadcast of information. Every shift of weight, every micro-expression, every barely perceptible change in breathing became intelligence that could be read by anyone trained to see it. Sterling wasn't trained. He was just watching her the way he watched everything, calculating what could be extracted, what needed to be controlled, what posed a risk to the careful arrangement he'd constructed. "I clean those rooms," Sarah said quietly. "When I notice medication discrepancies during cleaning cycles, I flag them for the day nurses to verify. Standard protocol for patient safety." Medication discrepancies. Sterling set the chart down on the counter, his fingers drumming once against the plastic cover. "That's an interesting characterization of what amounts to questioning medical decisions made by attending physicians. Which would be outside your scope of practice, wouldn't you say?" The question was rhetorical. Sterling wasn't waiting for an answer because he'd already decided what the answer would be. Sarah understood that dynamic. She'd seen it in officers who felt threatened by competence that didn't bear their insignia. The script was always the same. First came the implication that you'd exceeded your authority, then came the isolation, then came the documentation that would precede the termination. She'd watched it happen to 3 enlisted medics in Sanjin Valley before she'd stopped being a medic and started being something else entirely. "I apologize if I overstepped, Dr. Sterling. I'll restrict my reviews to my direct assignments going forward." Sterling smiled, and the smile was the dangerous part because it was the smile of someone who'd just confirmed exactly what he needed to know. "I appreciate your attention to detail, Ms. Chen. It's exactly that kind of initiative that sometimes leads people to misunderstand the hierarchies that keep hospitals functioning smoothly. I'm sure you understand." She understood. She understood that he'd seen her meticulous attention to detail in medication logs and recognized it as a threat. She understood that he'd made a phone call or used a system login that shouldn't have been available to him, and he'd reviewed her access patterns to confirm what he already suspected, that she was looking at things beyond her scope, that she was noticing patterns, that she was the kind of person who couldn't help but see what everyone else was trained not to look at. She understood that this was the beginning of something, not the end. "I understand completely," Sarah said, and then she continued pushing the empty supply cart toward the supply closet without waiting for a response, because that was what invisible people did. They acknowledged and retreated, they deferred and disappeared. They made themselves smaller so that people like Sterling could continue whatever arrangement had generated the kind of pharmaceutical rep payment she'd noticed in the billing codes while restocking supply cabinets. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was already making calculations about her elimination, not understanding that the woman he was looking at had already eliminated herself for years ago, had already burned her identity so completely that even the Navy had stopped looking for her in places that existed. He was about to initiate a series of strategic moves designed to remove her from Oak Creek Memorial before she noticed something she absolutely couldn't unsee, but he had no way of knowing that the thing he was most afraid of her finding had already been found. The boots in room 314 carried coordinates that Sarah Chen had written in blood on a mountainside in Marjah, and somewhere in his sedation, James Rivera carried the same knowledge. Sarah spent the rest of her shift restocking supplies in the standard pattern, her movements precise and unremarkable, her attention perfectly distributed across the 100 small tasks that made the ICU function. She didn't return to room 314. She didn't check on Rivera's vital signs beyond what any floor nurse would do. She simply existed in the way she'd perfected, present without being noticed, competent without drawing attention, careful in ways that suggested nothing more interesting than conscientiousness. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal mechanical song, and the rain continued its percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the institutional darkness of the hospital, two people carried the same secret in their blood without knowing the other was carrying it at all. The unit felt different at dusk. The fluorescent light seemed dimmer, or maybe Sarah's eyes were adjusting to a new kind of exhaustion, the kind that came not from sleeplessness but from being seen. She moved through the evening medication rounds with the precision of someone who'd learned that every action could be weaponized against her, and she was beginning to understand that Dr. Sterling had already made his first move. Rivera's room was at the end of the west corridor, third door on the left. Sarah knew the way by now, the rhythm of it muscle memory, left turn past the nurse's station, right past the supply closet where someone had left a half-empty coffee cup from this morning, then the gentle curve toward the patient rooms. The evening light slanted through the windows in thick amber bars. She carried Rivera's 6 p.m. vitals on a clipboard, the numbers routine and unremarkable, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 62, O2 sat 98% on room air. Everything stable. Everything documented with the meticulous precision that had kept her alive in conditions where sloppy notation meant body bags. When she pushed open the door, she found Sterling already there, standing beside the bed with his hands in his coat pockets, his posture the kind of casual arrogance that only came from never having been told no. Rivera's daughter sat in a visitor's chair, maybe 12 years old, reading aloud from a book, something about a girl and a horse and a ranch in Montana. Her voice stopped the moment Sarah entered. "Ah, Nurse Chen," Sterling said, his tone the verbal equivalent of a handshake that crushed fingers on purpose. "Perfect timing. I was just reviewing your documentation on Mr. Rivera's intake yesterday." Sarah set the medication cart against the wall, her movements deliberate and slow. She did not answer. In her experience, questions posed this way were not actually questions. "This is completely unacceptable," Sterling continued, gesturing to the chart with the kind of dismissive flourish that made the daughter look up from her book with obvious discomfort. "You've noted every minor vital fluctuation like you're writing a dissertation. Every breath, every heartbeat variation. What is this, nurse night shift? We document efficiently here, not like we're cataloging your feelings." There it was. The nickname, delivered with surgical precision in front of a child, in front of the patient's monitor, in front of a room full of people who would absorb this moment and repeat it. Sarah stood motionless. Her hands did not clench. Her jaw did not tighten visibly. Instead, she took one measured breath, the kind that came from muscle memory of situations where breathing wrong could be the thing that killed you, and a single tear escaped from her left eye. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of devastating calm that made the air pressure change. "I document what matters, Doctor." Sterling's jaw tightened. She watched it happen, watched him process that she had not cried and scrambled and apologized, that instead she had stood there with tears on her face and spoken like someone who'd survived things he couldn't fathom. The daughter had gone back to her book, clearly uncomfortable, and the moment stretched thin and dangerous before Sterling turned away, muttering something about attitude problems and lack of regard for hierarchy. Sarah checked Rivera's for sights, perfect, no redness or swelling, and hung the evening antibiotics without another word. When she left the room, she could feel Sterling stare against her back like a physical thing, heavy and searching and angry in a way that suggested he was not used to being unmoved by his own words. 2 hours later, at the shift change when the night nurses arrived and the day staff peeled away toward the parking garage, Sarah took her break. She needed those 15 minutes the way a drowning person needs air. Her Tupperware container sat in the break room refrigerator, labeled with her initials in black permanent marker, because even food could be stolen or contaminated if you weren't careful, and she'd learned long ago to mark what was hers. The break room itself was a testament to institutional beige, linoleum that hummed faintly under fluorescent panels, a microwave that smelled perpetually of fish base, someone's regret, a refrigerator that had not been cleaned in approximately 6 years. She sat at the small table in the corner, the one that faced the door, and opened her container. The food was simple: grilled chicken, brown rice, steamed broccoli. Nothing that could go wrong. Nothing that invited complexity. Around her, 6 other nurses chatted in the easy camaraderie of people who had not recently been publicly shamed by the hospital's most senior attending physician. They drank coffee from ceramic mugs and laughed at something someone's kid had said at soccer practice, and Sarah sat and ate mechanically, each bite a gesture toward normalcy. Then, nearly simultaneously, 6 phones buzzed. The sound was like a swarm of angry wasps, coordinated and sudden. Sarah watched from the corner as the nearest nurse glanced at her screen, her expression shifting. Text thread. Group chat. Whatever the message was, it triggered an immediate exodus. One nurse stood abruptly, muttering about needing to check on a medication verification. Another announced she had to run to pharmacy. Within 15 seconds, the break room had emptied completely, leaving only Sarah and the fluorescent hum and her container of chicken and rice. She did not need to read the message to know what it said. She could extrapolate from the coordinated departure: Sterling was incoming. A man who wielded power the way other people wielded kindness, as a tool for disruption, for making people smaller. The nursing staff had learned, or had been taught through some mechanism she did not fully understand, that proximity to both Sarah and Sterling created a gravitational collision. The solution was simple: scatter. Leave her alone. Leave the danger uncontaminated. Sarah finished her meal in silence. The vending machine hummed its low mechanical song. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beat steadily. She was careful to clean her container thoroughly, to dry it with a paper towel, to place it back in the refrigerator exactly as she had found it. Control what you can control. Everything else is an illusion. The next morning, during the shift change when both day and night nursing staff overlapped in the hallway between 7:06 a.m. and 7:19 a.m., Sterling posted his next move. It was a printout, laminated in clear plastic, pinned to the bulletin board outside the medication room where everyone had to look at it. Sarah did not seek it out. She saw it the way you see a predator that has decided to hunt in daylight, because the whole ecosystem shifts when something that large stops hiding. The paper was official, bearing the hospital's letterhead and the word disciplinary notice in bold font at the top. Her name. Her initials. The accusations laid out in Sterling's precise handwriting: failure to follow chain of command. Excessive documentation creating liability concerns. Counseling required. 20 staff members saw it as they moved through the medication room, as they checked the schedule board, as they organized their assignment sheets. Some read the entire notice. Others glanced and looked away. All of them would remember it the way people remember car crashes: the exact position of the bodies, the angle of the debris. Sarah stood in front of the board reading the notice for perhaps 30 seconds longer than necessary. Her coffee cup, purchased 5 years ago from a hospital fundraiser, sat warm in her left hand. Her scrubs were pressed. Her name tag was straight. She was, to any observer, simply a nurse reading unit announcements. But her hands, those hands that had performed field surgeries in conditions where sterilization meant running water that might not be clean, stayed absolutely steady. The coffee did not ripple. Dr. Sterling appeared beside her without fanfare, the way he seemed to move through the hospital like something that operated outside normal space. Some people just aren't cut out for teamwork. Night shift, he said quietly, for her ears only. Maybe you'd do better somewhere less structured. A clinic. Maybe home health. He was suggesting she quit. He was suggesting she had failed. He was suggesting, with the measured courtesy of a man who had never faced consequences for anything, that she was the problem. Sarah turned to face him fully. She was perhaps 6 inches shorter than he was, and probably 50 pounds lighter, and she had been trained in combat by the United States Navy to operate under conditions that most people could not imagine surviving. She looked into his eyes, grey, cold, convinced of their own rightness, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 years of burying herself, of choosing invisibility over recognition, of surviving things that had no names. "I've survived worse than you, Doctor." The fluorescent lights above them hummed their eternal mechanical song. Around them, the shift change continued, nurses pulling charts, doctors reviewing labs, the 1,000 small coordinations that kept a hospital functioning. But Sterling took a step back. His hand, which had been resting casually in his coat pocket, withdrew slightly. Something in her eyes had shifted, or perhaps something in her voice had registered as a threat in a way that his own brutality had not anticipated. For just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across his face, not fear, not quite, but a glimmer of recognition that he was standing in front of someone whose quiet was not the quiet of submission. Then his expression hardened again. He recovered his smirk. He turned away with a comment about attitude problems and disciplinary measures, and Sarah stood by the bulletin board holding her warm coffee cup, knowing that the equation had fundamentally shifted. She had stopped being a victim in his narrative and become something else entirely, a woman who did not break when pressed, who absorbed his words like armor absorbed bullets, who looked at him with eyes that had already survived the worst that the world could offer. The next 3 days of her schedule, when she returned from her mandatory days off, showed only routine assignments, wound care, vitals, medication administration for the lowest acuity patients on the unit. The medical complexity that had characterized her previous shifts, the patients requiring careful monitoring, the cases that demanded precision, had been redistributed to other nurses. And Rivera, the young Marine with the Marjah coordinates on his forearm, had been moved to Dr. Sterling's direct service, with restricted access orders that required attending physician approval for any nursing interventions beyond basic vital signs and hygiene care. She noticed it all with the same observational precision that had kept her alive in desert villages where the difference between surviving and not surviving often came down to who noticed the detail everyone else missed. The conference room at Oak Creek Memorial occupied the northeast corner of the administrative wing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Raleigh's skyline, and Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived 17 minutes early to arrange the leather chairs precisely as he wanted them. He'd learned decades ago that positioning mattered. The light behind him would cast his face in shadow while illuminating the faces of the 3 people he was about to manipulate. Chief of Staff Eleanor Vasquez. Board member David Chen, no relation to the nurse, though the coincidence had amused Sterling during his research. Board member Thomas Hargrove, whose pharmaceutical consulting fees constituted roughly 30% of his annual income, money that funded his lake house and his daughter's Tulane tuition. Sterling opened the file on the mahogany table with the care of a surgeon presenting a malignancy. Inside lay the documentation he'd spent the previous evening constructing, a background report flagging Sarah's 3-year employment gap with clinical language that made absent sound like derangement. Credentialing discrepancy, the first page read. Candidate unable to account for 2021 to 2024 whereabouts. Previous employment records show termination following reported instability incidents. The file was elegant fiction. Every line was technically accurate. She had vanished for 3 years, and those years had indeed involved military service. She wasn't advertising, but the framing transformed legitimate privacy into suspicious pathology. Sterling had learned this technique from a former FBI consultant he'd hired specifically for this moment. The truth, weaponized. Eleanor Vasquez arrived at 3:33 p.m., Thomas Hargrove at 3:49. David Chen was always punctual, 3:50 exactly, moving through the door with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent his career managing institutional risk. Sterling waited until they were seated before speaking. I need to raise significant concerns about our night shift nurse, he began, his voice carrying the measured gravity of a clinician presenting diagnostic findings. Sarah Chen. During routine credentialing review, we discovered substantial gaps in her background documentation. 3 years unaccounted for. Previous supervisor reports instability. And more troubling, he paused for effect, letting the silence accumulate like pressure. Her charting patterns suggest obsessive attention to details that go beyond standard nursing protocols. This level of meticulousness often indicates anxiety disorder or obsessive-compulsive presentation. Eleanor frowned at the file. She's been exemplary. The family of that patient, Rivera, mentioned how attentive she was. Which is precisely the problem, Sterling continued, his tone never wavering. This hypervigilance, this obsessive documentation, it's not professional excellence. It's pathological. And when someone with hidden background and psychological instability begins questioning pharmaceutical protocols, questioning my treatment decisions. He let the implication hang. Thomas Hargrove's face had already shifted. His pharmaceutical consulting fees depended entirely on Sterling's continued favor and discretion. Sterling watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the moment Hargrove realized that protecting Sterling was the same as protecting his income. "What are you recommending?" David Chen asked carefully. "Immediate administrative leave pending investigation. 48 hours, maximum. During that time, we contact her former supervisor." Sterling slid a name across the table, a contact number, all of it fabricated but printed on official-looking letterhead, and initiate state licensing review. If there are genuine credentialing issues, the state needs to know. If there aren't, the investigation exonerates her. But we cannot have someone in her mental state caring for vulnerable patients. Eleanor studied the file. This seems aggressive without evidence of actual harm. Yet, Sterling said quietly. "Without evidence yet. I'm suggesting we prevent harm rather than respond to it." David Chen's phone lit up. He glanced at it, then back at Sterling. "The board can authorize a preliminary investigation. 48 hours, administrative leave, pending outcome. If nothing substantive emerges, she's reinstated with full back pay and an apology." He paused. "But if there's any foundation to these concerns, we escalate immediately." Sterling nodded. This was sufficient. The dominoes were beginning to move. By 5:15 p.m., Eleanor had drafted the formal letter. By 5:38 p.m., Sterling had already called his golf partner, State Medical Board investigator Raymond Paulson, a man whose handicap and discretion were equally flexible. "Ray, Marcus Sterling. I need a favor." The words were unnecessary, the entire relationship was predicated on favors. A nurse at Oak Creek, credentialing gaps, possible instability. "I'm going to have someone contact you claiming to be her former supervisor." Her name was Sarah Chen, Navy background, employment gap from 2021 to 2024. "When they call, I need them to hear about documented instability, paranoid behavior, inability to follow chain of command." "Marcus, I can't just..." "You absolutely can. She'll be reinstated if the story doesn't hold. But if it does, we potentially prevent a patient safety incident. This is professional due diligence, Ray. And remember, your daughter's medical school tuition comes from somewhere." The pause was brief. Ray Paulson made approximately $42,000 annually as a state investigator. His daughter's Georgetown Medical School tuition was $135,000 per year. The math was simple. "I'll be ready," Ray said. By 6:38 p.m., Sterling had composed the false supervisor narrative and sent it to a contact broker, a woman named Patricia Vance who'd built a lucrative side business creating fictional employment references for people with reasons to hide their pasts. She'd never met Sterling, and he'd never met her. The transaction occurred entirely through encrypted email and cryptocurrency. $5,500. Patricia's response came within an hour, a new phone number, voicemail greeting, email address, all registered under the name Dr. Margaret Holt, Naval Reserve Medical Corps, all entirely fabricated. By 7:15 p.m., Sterling had personally entered Rivera's chart and modified the sedation protocol. The resident who'd been covering Rivera's care, a nervous third-year named Dr. Ashton Mitchell, had made the tactical error of asking questions about the patient's increased drowsiness. Sterling had simply adjusted the orders himself, increasing the benzodiazepine dosage from 2 mg every 6 hours to 4 mg every 4 hours, under the clinical justification of agitation management, though Rivera had shown no such symptoms. He then reassigned the primary nurse, a woman named Helen Watts who'd worked night shift for 19 years and had the kind of patient advocacy instincts that made her dangerous, to the pediatric floor, effectively removing her from Rivera's care. And he'd instructed Dr. Mitchell personally, no medication changes without my direct approval. The family is anxious. We need stability in his current management. Clear. Clear, Mitchell had responded, relieved to have authority removed from his own shoulders. By 9:45 p.m., Rivera's jugular vein had begun to distend slightly, a barely perceptible swelling that meant his central venous pressure was climbing. His skin had taken on a faint grey undertone. The monitors hadn't alarmed yet because Sterling had specifically adjusted the alarm thresholds during his chart modifications. The protocol he'd implemented would keep Rivera sedated and unresponsive while his condition gradually deteriorated, not so fast as to trigger intervention, but fast enough that by morning, there would be clear evidence of acute decompensation that had occurred during the night shift, on Sarah's watch, on her final evening before administrative leave. It was elegant. It was precise. It was, Sterling thought as he reviewed his handiwork one final time, exactly the kind of carefully orchestrated sequence that had made him untouchable for 17 years. He'd left the formal letter on Eleanor's desk at 9:50 p.m., and she'd arranged for security to deliver it to Sarah at 10:15, as Sarah finished her evening medication rounds. The letter was concise, effective immediately. You are placed on administrative leave pending investigation into credentialing discrepancies and fitness for duty. Please turn over your badge and exit through the main security desk. An investigator will contact you within 48 hours. Sarah had read it in the medication room, standing in the fluorescent glare between rows of controlled substances, her hands absolutely steady as they held the paper. She'd stood there for 43 seconds without moving. Then she'd photographed the letter with her phone, placed the original in her pocket, and returned to her final rounds with the kind of mechanical precision that would have impressed a clinician trained in trauma response. Because that's exactly what it was, the body moving forward when the mind has received catastrophic news. At 11:05 p.m., she'd passed Rivera's room and stopped. Just stopped. Her eyes had caught what Sterling's modified protocols were designed to hide, the subtle wrongness that only someone trained in field medicine recognizes immediately. Jugular distension. Skin pallor. The quality of his breathing had changed. She'd checked the chart. Sterling's new orders. Her jaw had tightened, but that was the only visible response. She'd pulled up the monitoring strip and photographed it with her personal phone, a gesture that looked small but constituted documentation of Sterling's sabotage. Then she'd done something that would define everything that followed. She'd paged the rapid response team with a single message, cardiac concern, room 314. Sterling received the notification at 11:07 p.m., and the temperature in his office had dropped so precipitously he could see his own breath. His network of favors, his careful orchestration, his 48-hour window, all of it was about to collapse in front of witnesses if the rapid response team actually found something substantive. He'd gotten to the ER in 90 seconds. And that's when he saw her. Sarah was standing just outside Rivera's room, her hands empty, her expression neutral, her eyes tracking every monitor readout. She was still wearing her badge, the badge she was supposed to have surrendered. And when Sterling arrived, radiating fury, she looked directly at him with the kind of calm that only exists in people who've already lost everything and found they were still standing. His JVD is elevated, she said quietly. Skin pallor. Changed respiratory pattern. I documented it. Sterling's response was automatic, contemptuous. You're on administrative leave. You have no authority here. Step away from the patient. But the rapid response resident was already moving toward the monitor, already seeing what Sarah had seen, already understanding that something had shifted in Rivera's clinical presentation in the last 4 hours. Sarah stepped back from the room, and as she did, she slid her phone into Sterling's line of sight, just visible enough that he saw the photographs of his own orders. She didn't say another word. The code blue alarm shattered the 3 a.m. silence like a gunshot through glass. Sarah's eyes snapped open from the nursing station where she'd been documenting, not from surprise, but from recognition. The monitor screaming from room 412 wasn't random. She'd seen Rivera's vitals trending toward this exact moment for hours. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular vein. Blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart, suffocating it from the inside. She moved before the rapid response team could assemble, her feet already carrying her toward the room. No hesitation. No calculation. Just muscle memory that had lived through 1,000 moments worse than this, moments where speed was the difference between a body coming home or a body coming home. The resident stood frozen at Rivera's bedside, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something he could understand. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. The attending was somewhere else, 3 floors down, Sarah would later learn, in a fabricated consult Dr. Sterling had arranged specifically to ensure no senior physician would be present when the crisis hit. Sarah entered the room like cold water, quiet, efficient, utterly present. She didn't announce herself. She didn't wait for permission. She moved to the bedside and assessed in 3 seconds what the resident couldn't see: pupils reactive, breath sounds diminished, skin pale as chalk, O2 sat dropping from 90 to 87 to 84. The boy's body was drowning in its own fluid. He needs a pericardiocentesis now or he dies, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the careful, deferential tone she used in break rooms. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Someone get me an 18-gauge spinal needle and ultrasound. Move. The resident blinked. I've never. I know. The words hung there, not unkind, just factual. Sarah was already prepping the site below Rivera's xiphoid process, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in field hospitals and forward operating bases and the back of a Black Hawk helicopter while rounds pinged off the fuselage. She didn't need to think about what her hands were doing. They remembered everything. The ultrasound tech appeared with the machine, Katie, the night shift tech who'd watched Sarah work for 3 weeks and knew better than to waste time with questions. She positioned the probe while Sarah's fingers found the landmarks on Rivera's chest, mapping out the anatomy she could see through his skin the way cartographers read maps. There, Sarah said, pointing at the ultrasound screen. The pericardial sac was distended, filled with dark fluid. A massive effusion. Whatever had been bleeding into that space, and Sarah would later find the answer in Sterling's sabotage, the medication he'd ordered that thinned Rivera's blood without medical justification, was crushing the boy's heart. Sarah positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder, her thumb finding the plunger. The room had gone quiet except for the whine of the monitors and the hiss of the ventilator. Even the resident seemed to understand he was watching someone who existed in a different category than him. The needle advanced. Sarah aspirated. Dark blood filled the syringe. 50 milliliters of pericardial fluid, 50 milliliters of pressure released from around a heart that could finally beat again. Rivera's blood pressure climbed. 90 over 50. 95 over 60. The monitor steadied into a rhythm that sounded like forgiveness. His oxygen saturation rose to 92, 94, 96. The boy's face flushed with color as blood flow returned to tissue that had been starving for it. He needs 2 liters of normal saline, Sarah said, already discarding the needle into the sharps container. Continuous monitoring. Check a troponin level and get cardiology down here within the hour. She glanced at the resident. Can you do those things, or do you need me to write them down? Yes. I can. His voice was smaller now, hollowed out by the recognition of what he'd almost allowed to happen. The room went silent. The kind of silence that follows a moment of perfection, when everything breaks down into its simplest components: a nurse who knew what she was doing, a doctor who didn't, and a Marine who'd just gotten his life back. That's when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. He stopped short, taking in the scene, Rivera's stable vitals, the ultrasound machine, the syringe with dark blood, and Sarah standing at the center of it all with her hands already reaching for the next task. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, confusion, and then something worse. Calculation. The moment he understood that his narrative had just collapsed. What is the meaning of this? His voice was ice and condescension, the voice of a man who'd built his world on the assumption that he would always be the smartest person in the room. Nurse Chen, you are not authorized to be here. You are on immediate suspension. Step away from my patient. Sarah didn't step away. She met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world has to offer. He was in cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart. He was minutes from arrest. She paused. One breath. He would have died if I'd waited for authorization. That procedure requires physician oversight. You have exceeded your scope of practice. Sterling's voice was rising now, losing its control. He could feel his grasp slipping. Everyone in the room could see it. I'm calling security immediately. You are terminated. Effective now. The rapid response team had arrived by then, crowding into the doorway, 5 more people to witness the moment when Dr. Marcus Sterling's world became very small and very cold and very limited. But Sarah wasn't watching him anymore. She was moving to the next task, checking the fall line, adjusting the ventilator settings, doing the 1,000 small things that kept a Marine breathing while a doctor made the worst decision of his career. By noon, security had escorted her out. They came to the break room where Sarah was packing her locker, a cardboard box that had once held surgical gloves. Into it went the cracked mug someone had given her at Christmas, the one that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent that she'd watered faithfully for 3 weeks even though it seemed determined not to survive. And the photograph. The 8 of them standing in front of the motor pool at Camp Lejeune in 2011, sun-bright and impossibly young, still believing the world made sense. Martinez. Holloway. Webb. Chen. Garrett. Rodriguez. 2 of them were names on a wall now. Another was a name on a missing persons report. Rivera was still on active duty, but his right hand had 80% nerve damage and he'd never shoot straight again. The security guard, Tom, the one who'd always held the door for her, couldn't quite meet her eyes as he walked her toward the exit. I'm sorry. Orders from Dr. Sterling. I know, Sarah said. And she did. She'd seen this pattern before. The powerful protected themselves. The honest ones got boxed out. The world ran on favors and silence and people knowing when to look away. Rain hammered the parking lot like artillery. Sarah stood under the overhang, cardboard box growing damp against her chest, and watched the city wake up without her. 7 a.m. and the morning shift was arriving, all of them moving past her without stopping, without acknowledging that something had broken in the night and they'd all chosen not to look at it. She didn't cry. That was the thing about combat training, it taught you how to turn grief into fuel and terror into focus. She just stood there in the rain, holding a box that contained the only evidence that she'd ever existed in this place, and made a decision that would change everything. But she didn't know that yet. What she didn't know was that Rivera was already awake in his room, fighting through the fog of sedation that Sterling had increased by 30%, his mind clawing toward a memory that felt more real than the ceiling tiles above him. What she didn't know was that his 12-year-old daughter had been reading to him from his own journals, journals he'd kept hidden from everyone, journals that contained the names of every person who'd saved his life in Marjah, every person who'd earned his loyalty and his silence. What she didn't know was that Commander Marcus Webb, Rivera's team leader, the man who'd led them into that LZ and out of it, had been getting increasingly worried calls from Rivera's family, asking questions about a nurse named Sarah, a nurse who'd been there that night, a nurse who'd disappeared from their son's life as suddenly as she'd appeared. What she didn't know was that the rain falling on the parking lot was washing away the last piece of her cover, and somewhere in the hospital, people were starting to ask questions that would undo 3 years of careful invisibility. 24 hours. That's all it would take. 24 hours for the truth to walk through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial on boots that had never quite recovered from the mud of Marjah, boots worn by a Marine who remembered every face that had saved him, boots that belonged to someone who'd made a promise in 2012 and never forgot. Sarah had returned to collect her final paycheck when she heard the commotion. Not the sterile urgency of a code blue, but something rawer, a man's voice cracking across the hallway, demanding someone, searching for someone. She stood at the payroll window with her envelope unopened, listening to her own name echo from Rivera's room like a prayer she'd spent 3 years trying not to answer. The attending nurse stepped aside as Sarah approached, something shifting in her posture. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. Rivera was sitting upright for the first time since admission, his eyes moving across the doorway until they found her, and when they did, his whole body stilled. He was still tethered to monitors, still dripping antibiotics and saline, but he was awake. Completely, searingly awake. His hand moved toward the bed rail with the trembling of someone rebuilding motor control, and his voice came out rough as concrete. Chief Chen. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered by someone who'd waited 12 years to speak it. Sarah didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers just barely curling. The old response, the trained response, compress emotion into the smallest possible space, let only breath remain visible. Dad. His daughter Madison was in the corner, younger than Sarah expected, maybe 12, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's sharp chin. The girl was holding a leather journal, worn soft at the spine, and she stood up as recognition began assembling itself across her features like pieces clicking into place. You're the senior chief petty officer. You're the one from Dad's journals. From Marjah. The room stopped. Monitors continued their electronic whisper. The ventilator in the next room wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent to the collapse of everything Sarah had constructed. 7 words from a child with her father's eyes, and the invisible life became visible. She held pressure on my femoral for 2 hours, Rivera said, his voice climbing toward something between gratitude and breakage. She called in fire support while her own blood, he couldn't finish. His hand was shaking. Chen, he said, showing her his forearm, the tattoo, the coordinates below it in precise digits. 2012, the day I got stateside. An attending physician appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, and her expression shifted from clinical to something approaching awe. She stepped backward without speaking, which meant she was already piecing it together, already understanding that the nurse she'd seen loading a cardboard box into a cab 24 hours ago hadn't been fired for incompetence. She'd been fired for threatening the wrong person. She'd been fired because she saw too clearly. I need you to understand something, Madison said, and there was steel in her voice, a child speaking truths adults had somehow missed. She was holding up the journal, its pages filled with handwriting, sketches, coordinates. Dad read to me every night about Marjah. About the medevac under fire. About how the chief, about how you dragged him 6 miles through enemy position while calling for extraction and bleeding out. He never forgot your name. Never. He's been looking for you since he got back. The hospital began to move. Not chaos, something more coordinated than that, something like a system recognizing its own dysfunction and beginning to realign itself. A man in a charcoal suit appeared in the hallway, FBI credentials catching the fluorescent light, flanked by a woman with dark hair pulled back so tight it made Sarah's scalp hurt in sympathetic memory. Chief Chen? The man's voice carried the weight of months of investigation, of files stacked and cross-referenced, of patterns that only became visible to someone willing to look long enough. I'm Special Agent Curtis. We've been investigating Dr. Sterling for insurance fraud over the past 18 months. We came to the hospital this morning to secure his records. He opened a folder thick enough to require both hands. Your chart corrections. Every single one you made when Sterling insisted the documentation was excessive. You created a pattern. You created evidence. Every discrepancy you corrected, every notation you made in the margins, every question you raised about billing codes, it gave us what we needed to build this case. Sarah's voice, when it came, was barely audible. How much? $340,000 in kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives alone, the female agent said. That's what we can prove. The conspiracy runs deeper, he's connected to at least 4 other physicians in the cardiovascular division. You documented it all. You did it meticulously. You did it while he was destroying your career. The chief of staff appeared next, his face draining toward a color that wasn't quite white. Behind him came Commander Webb, in dress uniform, medals precise as mathematics, and the moment he saw Sarah, recognition moved across his features like a wave breaking. His salute was crisp, fist to chest, arm extended, a gesture that transformed the hallway into something other than a hospital corridor. It became a place where truth could finally stand. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen, he said formally. Your service record has been reviewed. Your actions tonight have been documented. The State Medical Board has been notified. Dr. Sterling's license is being suspended pending full investigation. Then the security guard appeared, the same man who'd walked Sarah out with her cardboard box, the former Army medic whose jaw had tightened with discomfort as he'd done his job. He was walking beside Dr. Sterling now, but in a different configuration. Sterling's hands were empty except for his phone, his face arranged in the expression of a man watching a house collapse while he was still inside it. I believe you know the way out, Doctor, the security guard said quietly. His voice carried no malice, only the absolute finality of someone watching another person receive consequences. He set down a cardboard box identical to the one Sarah had carried, empty except for the promise of what would fill it. Sterling's nameplate. His diploma. The pretense that would have to be deconstructed, notarized, and filed away. The hallway filled with staff, nurses Sarah had worked alongside for 2 years, nursing assistants who'd helped her turn patients, respiratory therapists who'd seen her methodically document every intervention. They moved toward her not with pity but with something closer to vindication, as if truth itself required witnesses to acknowledge it. Sarah stood in the center of it all, her hand still curled, her voice still the careful instrument she'd maintained for 3 years. But something was happening behind her ribs, a loosening, a permission, the first exhale after holding breath for an immeasurable distance. 1 week later, Rivera stood in his hospital room without tubes. His daughter sat on the edge of the bed, and Sarah was there because she'd learned that refusing to appear in triumph was its own kind of cowardice. The man she'd carried through Marjah held a showbox. Inside it, the boots, his combat boots, the ones he'd carried for 12 years, the leather worn soft in places and cracked in others, the sole barely holding against another 1,000 miles of walking. They never felt right after that day, he said, placing them in her hands. Because they carried your blood too. Sarah looked down and saw it, the faint darkening in the leather at the heel, the stain that 17 years hadn't quite erased. Pain had been data once. Now it was simply the weight of survival in her palms. Her hands trembled once, and she didn't hide it. Commander Webb delivered the envelope personally, hand to hand. Inside was a formal invitation embossed in gold leaf, requesting the presence of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen at a Medal of Honor recognition ceremony at the White House, where she would be honored for 2 distinct acts of valor, one in the field, one in the hospital, both equally measured against the standard of making the impossible choice to save lives when silence would have been easier. The president reads the fraud case files himself sometimes, Webb said. He wanted to meet the person who saw clearly enough to document it. Oak Creek Memorial held a formal ceremony 3 days later. The chief nursing officer made a public apology, her words precise and insufficient. The hospital board reinstated Sarah with back pay, offered her the chief of nursing position, requested her input on new whistleblower protection protocols. Through the window, Sarah watched Sterling in the parking lot, loading boxes into his car with the efficiency of someone who'd done this calculation and found it inescapable. His medical license was gone. His consulting contracts, severed. The pharmaceutical companies issued statements so terse they were almost aggressive in their distance from him. By the following month, Sterling was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table at a strip mall off Capitol Boulevard, the kind of setup that required no credentials, no trust, no belief that his voice mattered anymore. He'd been competent once. Now he was just another person learning to be invisible, though unlike Sarah, he had no hero underneath the grey. He had only the silence of consequences. Sarah accepted the chief of nursing position. She created a protocol, Chen protocol, they'd eventually call it in medical schools, that protected staff who reported discrepancies, that valued the meticulous as much as the confident, that understood that sometimes the person who sees most clearly is the one everyone else mistakes for meek. She placed the combat boots on her office desk beside the cracked mug and the photograph of her unit, half of them now names on wall somewhere, the other half scattered across the country learning to live with what they'd seen. Madison visited weekly, calling her chief, bringing her journal entries that had become something more than memory, they'd become testimony, documentation, the proof that what Sarah had done in silence was exactly as loud as the Medal of Honor ceremony would eventually be. The nightmares didn't stop. But now they had a counterweight, a girl with her father's eyes, a Marine who'd remembered her name, a hospital full of staff who understood that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you made it this far, you understand now that the person you're standing next to might be carrying weight you can't measure. Sometimes the quiet ones have survived the impossible. Sometimes the ones you're quick to dismiss have already saved your life more than once. If this story resonated with you, if you understand the cost of speaking truth in a system built on silence, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us about a time you misjudged someone before discovering their strength. Because those stories matter. Those stories are how we learn to see each other clearly.